You know, there was a time in this country when the Jetsons were just emerging, the cartoon characters, the future. Everybody was talking about the future. This was back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And there was a very interesting dialogue that was going on in the United States. We had seen in this country, and you can find graphs of this. The Center for American Progress did a great chart of this over at the Think Progress blog a few months ago. We had seen productivity, per person productivity in the United States, steadily increase in the founding of this country. Per person productivity jumped up, for example, when the cotton gin was invented in the early 19th century. It jumped up again when steam engines became, the leading edge of the Industrial Revolution around the time of the Civil War. And it jumped up again as, after Colonel Titus drilled his first oil well, or Colonel Drake, rather, in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1867. And throughout the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, as the Industrial Revolution moved from steam to internal combustion engines, and Mr. Diesel's product came out, and we started lighting with kerosene. And then it jumped again in the early 20th century as kerosene lights and gas lights were replaced by electric lights, and America was electrified, and electrical appliances came about. And throughout all, and right up until the 1960s, 70s, and the early 80s, what we had seen literally from the days of George Washington until the inauguration of Ronald Reagan was that the cost of labor, in other words, wages, and productivity tracked each other. As productivity went up, even if it went up because of the invention of the steam engine, even if it went up because of the invention of oil-based, of internal combustion engines, regardless of even if productivity went up because of washing machines instead of hand launderers. Yes, there were dislocations. Industries changed. The buggy whip industry famously went out of business. It was replaced by the auto industry. But throughout this whole period of time, from the founding of our country until Reagan's presidency, as productivity went up, so did wages. So what people were seeing in the 60s and 70s and early 80s was that productivity was about to make another massive leap forward. Now, with every one of the prior leaps forward, what had happened was leisure time increased. People back in the early years of this republic, outside of the wealthy planters and things, but the average working person typically was working a 6 or 7 day week and 10 or 12 hour day. And that was pretty much the norm up until the middle of the 19th century. In fact, you could argue that was the norm up until the progressive era around the 1910s. And then people started working 6 day weeks or 5 day weeks. And in fact, the 5 day week became standardized by the mid-1930s. And originally it was the 50-hour week, Teddy Roosevelt's 50-hour week. That became Franklin Roosevelt's 40-hour week, which meant that people had more leisure time. They had more time to spend with their family, more time to spend with their friends, more time to write poetry, more time to paint, more time to invent things, to tinker in their garage like Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs did on the weekends, and build things, invent things, create things. More leisure time. And the speculation, Jeffrey Dumaziter in 1967, he was able to proclaim a great historical inversion. In the year 1967, for the first time in American history, the average American worker spent more time in what is called leisure time. In other words, more time at home when he wasn't or she wasn't sleeping than at work. That was the peak, 1967. And at that point, everybody was looking at these trends and saying, okay, if this trend continues, productivity continues to increase, wages continue to track productivity, And people at some point say, instead of extra wages, I'll take a 4-day work week. Or I'll take a 30-hour week instead of a 40-hour week, because we'd already gone from a 50-hour week to a 40-hour week in the 20th century. And in the 19th century, we'd gone from a 60-hour week to a 50-hour week. So we were down to a 40-hour week in 1967. And there were all these articles being written, and those of you old enough to remember this know what I'm talking about. Those of you who did not consciously live through the 60s, 70s, or early 80s, trust me on this. You can easily find this stuff, although a lot of it isn't as easily Googleable. You'd have to, because the internet didn't exist at that time. So you'd have to go back and buy Life magazines from the 60s and 70s. But there was this huge dialogue in America about the coming leisure society. So the question I'd like to ask for this hour, among all the other things that we can be talking about, after we hear from our friends at the Firesign Theater, the question I'd like to ask is, what would America be like if wages had continued to track productivity? Now, here's what actually happened. Because we were heading for 30-hour work week. I mean, France went to a 35-hour work week in the 60s, or in the 70s, actually. And which is the direction that we were heading. But if you look at that graph, what you find is two really interesting things happened with the election of Ronald Reagan. One was that productivity continued to increase, and the line is fairly linear. I mean, all the way from George Washington right up to today, productivity has continuously increased on a per capita basis, per worker. But wages, which had, from the George Washington administration through the Jimmy Carter administration, had always increased at the same speed at which productivity increased, wages suddenly flattened out with the Reagan administration, and they have stayed flat for 30 years. So here's this huge gap, this yawning chasm that has opened up now 30 years later between flattened out wages and rising productivity. You can imagine these two lines. One is horizontal now. They used to be both going up, at an angle, like an incline going up a hill. They did that from 1870 to 1981. And then suddenly wages flattened out and productivity continued to increase. So in that gap was all this extra wealth, or all this spare time, all this leisure time. Where did it go? Well, it turns out that from the time Reagan became president until today, the top 1%, while the bottom 90%, about the bottom 80% have seen an 18% increase in their wages overall. The top 1% have seen a 257% increase in their wages. In other words, you didn't get that leisure time that everybody was talking about in the 60s and 70s that was coming, because the very, very rich took the money. The system got rigged. The Reagan administration and Reaganomics rigged the system to deny Americans leisure time. And it's reached the point now where not only are people no longer working 40-hour weeks like they were at that peak in 1967, but they're working 50-hour weeks and 60-hour weeks and 70-hour weeks. They're working 2 jobs, 3 jobs. 2, 3, 4 people in the household are working in order to keep the household intact. And the top 1% are doing better than they have ever done before. I mean, in the history of the country, maybe in the history of the world. So what would America be like if the 1% hadn't gamed the system and we had all seen the results of those increases in productivity?